Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to the second episode of our ESG Masterclass. My name's Alex Stickler and I'm part of IQEQ's ESG working group. We have recently launched IQEQ Compass, a holistic solution which incorporates ESG consultancy, assessment and reporting to enable alternative asset fund managers and institutional, corporate and private investors navigate multiple ESG frameworks, establish ESG targets and achieve them. But we wanted to do more than launch a product offering. We wanted to create value for our clients and provide them with insights that will help them in setting up their own ESG framework. We have launched a virtual ESG Masterclass series where during each episode, an industry expert will provide key insights and practical solutions on a wide range of ESG-related topics across risk strategy, capital allocation, framework, and reporting. These masterclasses are provided completely free of charge, and we will also be providing the opportunity to one of the attendees of our masterclass series to secure an ESG health check. The ESG health check will allow you to understand where your fund or company is currently positioned on the ESG spectrum, and the winner will be chosen at random. I am pleased to introduce you today to Lev Yuriditsky, Head of Intelligence at Sqope. Sqope S.A is a global provider of high-quality intelligence reports on individuals and corporate entities. They are headquartered in Luxembourg, with offices in Geneva and Tel Aviv, as well as a wide network across Asia, the CIS, and the Middle East. They have developed the ESG Reputational Assessment, a comprehensive ESG reputational report on funds, portfolio companies, and their leadership teams. Today, Lev will share his perspective on the very interesting topic of how to mitigate your ESG reputational risk. If you have any questions for Lev or myself, please send us an email on esg@iqeq.com.
Thank you very much, Alex. I appreciate that introduction, and hello to all. Thank you so much for joining. I'm happy to be speaking to you today from Tel Aviv, Israel, where I am based out of, where I work and live. And like Alex said, my name is Lev Yuriditsky. I am the head of intelligence of Sqope, and I've been with the company for just about a year now. And prior to that, I was working with the United Nations based in Jerusalem, where I was serving as a civil military coordinator. And prior to that, I spent most of my professional career in various capacities of intelligence, mostly with geopolitical risk, terror monitoring, conflict evaluation, and things of that nature. But like I said, now I'm with Sqope, and it is today that I will speak with you guys about ESG reputational risk, a subject that we at Sqope have been monitoring for a long time and have been developing services for that need for some time now. And we'll talk about that more in depth in a moment. But first, let me share with you the full agenda of the day, just so we can all be on the same page. So first, we can't talk about ESG without properly defining it. Even if you guys are all very familiar with ESG, I want to share with you how we here at Sqope see it. And afterwards, since we're talking about ESG reputational risk, I'll have to define reputation as well as how does it fit in particular with ESG. It will also talk a bit about what to look for when doing a reputational evaluation for ESG, how to evaluate the things that you find after completing your research. We'll share with you some case studies that we ourselves have come across. And finally, we will present to you the Sqope offering and what our solution is for ESG reputational risk and addressing that. So let's talk about ESG and what does it mean. So ESG, in a nutshell, obviously stands for environmental, social, and governance. So let's break it down briefly. So we're all on the same page and are talking about the same thing. So when we talk about environment in the framework of ESG, we're talking about what matters for a corporate's adherence to local and global environmental regulations, as well as their general efforts to operate in an environmentally friendly manner, regardless if they're following legal requirements or if they're going beyond that. This is important to make the distinction that we're not just talking about the legal regulations. And it's also important to note that an environmental evaluation takes into account the full logistical chain of a company's operations, and not just in one area. When we're talking about the social aspect of ESG, this is often very challenging to measure, and we'll talk about that later, and we'll give you some examples of the things we look for. But generally speaking, it's a very broad term related to the different social impacts that a company may have, and this could be how it impacts labor force, human rights practices, even animal welfare. Its approach to consumer protection, to diversity in the workforce, and things of that nature. There's obviously a lot more factors, but these are some of the ones that really stick out when it comes to social aspect of ESG. The G, you can call governance. It can also be corporate governance, because that's what really matters here. And it really relates to the management and board structure and membership within a company. This can include executive compensation. It can relate to the separation of powers between executives. We can talk about the code of conduct within a board, business ethics, the relationship with shareholders, even has to do with data security, corruption, and various other factors. But these are some of the main things that we think about when we talk about corporate governance and ESG. And it's important to note also that the demand for ESG is growing rapidly, and in the industry throughout, people are considering this a new mega trend. So now that we discussed ESG, we discussed the various factors within it, let's talk about what exactly is reputational risk. So again, this is something that at Sqope we've been dealing with for a long time. It's an integral part of our reports. Way before we discussed ESG, we were always talking about reputational risk. So I'm happy to share with you our experience of that. And essentially, defined very, very simply and broadly at the same time, reputational risk is the potential for the deeds or actions, whether they're intended or inadvertent. It could be of an individual or an entity. It's the potential for these deeds or actions to negatively impact the perception of a company. So the reputation of a company, it's important to note, can be really significantly damaged by the actions of executives or shareholders, as well as just the awareness from the public of the company policy not being in line with what is considered appropriate of the day. So it's also important to note that reputational damage is not a minor thing. It's not something to be dismissed, and it does lead to direct financial impacts. And it's important to note that more than 25% of a company's market value is attributable to reputation. So that's why I say it's really important to focus on the reputational risk and to not be dismissive of it. And also, I'd like to bring up a quote that was shared with me by a colleague of mine many years ago, and is that perception is reality. So even if something was not intended, even if something is misconstrued, if it becomes a perception, it can also become the reality in the minds of the public. And so it is not always in your control. I'd also like to leave you with a quote of someone who was not a colleague of mine, but Benjamin Franklin once said that it takes many good deeds to build a good reputation and only one bad one to lose it. And on the right, you can see the obviously very famous Elon Musk, and this is a very good example that I like to bring up about reputation and the damage that it does, the financial impact that it has on a company. And this is just one small example, but essentially just on one podcast that Elon Musk participated in, that he was a guest on, he was smoking marijuana on it with the host, and right afterwards, as a result, the stock of Tesla went down by approximately 7%. It did go back up in this case, but it is important to see that there was a direct impact on the finances of the company. So let's bring this all together now. We talked about ESG, we talked about reputation. So I want to show you how it's all related. So first of all, it's important to note that some ESG factors are measurable, they're objective and very clear, while others are more influenced by perception, as we spoke about, and popular opinion, nowadays largely from social media, but also on mainstream media and even comments within mainstream media. And they're all very connected to trends of the modern day. And we'll get into that a bit later, but the difference between measurable and immeasurable is very important, because some ESG factors you can actually do a proper audit on. You can look into documents and evaluate policy. For others, and this is what we like to look at, you actually have to measure the sentiment in the public of these various factors. So another thing I want to point out is not only are the ESG factors subject to reputational risk, the very implementation of ESG, especially as it becomes more popular. So how a company implements ESG, how a company talks about ESG, its actions in order to be on board with ESG, or the lack thereof, in and of itself holds reputational impacts for a company. It's also important to note that reputation can be particularly damaging to governance rankings. So essentially, if you're doing a ESG reputational analysis, it's important to note that the governance aspect can really be touched on by things that you'll find as far as reputation is concerned. So just some examples about how the faith in a company can easily be lost just by the actions and deeds, even comments from the board members and managerial staff. On top of that, just the very composition of a board can impact the reputation of a company, or the ESG reputation of a company, I should say. It's important to note that even comments that might be considered innocent or hobbies that might be very neutral or regular for someone in a company can have reputational risk. And one of these hobbies, for instance, at least in the USA and to some degree in Europe, is hunting. Regardless of what the opinions are about hunting, it's, for a lot of people, it's a very normal hobby, and at the same time, for a lot of people, it's an important hobby. So we've seen that companies have been attacked, their reputation have been severely damaged simply by one of the board members having this as a hobby. Indeed, identity can have reputational consequences. Someone's political affiliation, their social status, the way they present themselves. If this is an important person for a company, the way they're identified, especially political affiliation these days, can have major consequences for a company. And we're seeing it today after the incidents in the US, for instance, that executives who supported Trump and supported the actions that took place on January 6th, some of these companies are seeing major hits to their reputation as a direct result of comments that executives have made. So with all this, with social media in mind, with the general attention from the broader public to the behaviors of board members and executives and companies as a whole, it's important to note that navigating reputation has become exceptionally complex, and that's what we're here to address essentially. So I want to emphasize here that while I did speak about governance a moment ago, it's important to note that reputation is a factor that influences all aspects of ESG. So in the case of environment, we can talk about a company's climate and environmental policy and how that's perceived, and which expectations are set by the company as far as how it addresses its environmental impact. In addition, support for politicians with poor environmental track records and things of this nature can really impact the way a company's environmental reputation stands up. And so this shows how, and I will talk about this later in some case studies, it shows how the environmental reputation of a company can be impacted by the actions of the company as well. In the case of social, just some examples of how social reputation of a company can be damaged. This can come from comments from disgruntled employees. We've seen this a lot. It could be from real or perceived links to human rights abuses on the part of the company. Comments, statements, actions by the company or by executives in the company with regards to major social trends of the day, be it the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, and essentially how the company responds to these things can really impact its reputation. And I'm sure you all noticed that last year in 2020, and I think it was probably the first year, a lot of major companies change their logos, some rarely or sometimes longer. Reddit changed their logo to a black one in support of Black Lives Matter. A lot of companies in the summer changed their logo to have a rainbow colors in it to show support for LGBTQ peoples, and this is all their effort to maintain a positive social reputation. And we spoke about governance at length in the previous slide, but some aspects to consider is just in broad strokes are perceptions of cronyism or lack of qualifications within the board, and also again the actions or deeds or comments or even composition of the board members and managerial staff can really have an impact on the reputation, on the governance reputation of a company. So with all this in mind, let's talk a bit about the things that we look for. First, when it comes to environmental reputation, we're looking to understand from open source for the most part how a company is perceived as far as its pollution. Is it a company that takes action to minimize its waste? Is it a company that's perceived as actually dumping its waste or being responsible for a lot of waste? Has it done, if it's a logistics company or a company with physical products, has it done anything to reduce how much waste it produces? There are also companies that that are perceived as destroying the wildlife or local ecosystem. Companies who are known for regularly receiving fines, regulatory fines from different environmental bodies, be it local or international, or just being subject of criticism for it. We look for any sustainable, green or sustainable logistics and policies that a company has put into place, as well as statements or commitments to do so. And you'll see this a lot today and over recent years, where companies have basically, without yet taking action, the very idea of them addressing the actions that need to be taken, or basically making commitment to changes to reduce their footprint, is very important for bolstering their positive environmental reputation. And also supporting environmentally friendly politicians. This is something that the public does notice when a company or an executive within a company bolsters up a politician, even if it doesn't mean they're doing anything for their own company. The fact that they're supporting a politician who has very positive stances towards the environment is something that you want to look for when it comes to environmental reputation. When it comes to social reputation, some of the factors you want to look at are fair compensation within the company, and this is a topic of major discussion in today's age. People talk about the discrepancy of pay between the lowest tier in the company and the highest tier in the company, and so that's something you definitely want to look into. And you want to look into labor rights and policies, again, across the entire supply chain of a company, and seeing how the labor rights are respected. This could be anything from vacation days, maternity leave, paternity leave, sick leave, flexibility for working parents or people who are in school, things of this nature. Diversity in the labor force is also very important to understand, especially companies that are known to only hire people of a certain race or of a certain gender. They have a much worse reputation than those who are known to go out of their way, so to speak, or to make a strong effort to have a much more diverse workforce. So support for human rights is something you want to look at when it comes to social reputation. Again, a lot of times these are just statements, but they are important statements nevertheless, as far as bolstering up a company's reputation. And also support for social justice causes. Again, we spoke about it earlier, but it's important to emphasize, and we can see the direct impact from companies who do support social justice causes versus companies that stand against them or speak dismissively of them. And when it comes to governance, you want to look at management as a whole. So you want to look at the ethics of a board, whether there's strong signs of cronyism or nepotism, excessive compensation, and things of that nature. You also want to look at the qualification of the board members and see if the people seem like they deserve to be on the board, or if they're just there again for the reasons we mentioned earlier, for cronies reasons or nepotistic reasons. A company's governance reputation could be impacted by this, but also not just by resume, but also by who on the past successes and failures among the members of that board. And lastly, but definitely not least, you want to look at the business practices of the company and the management as a whole. Basically, you want to look for any signs of corruption, price fixing, bribery, and things of that nature. So you definitely want to evaluate when it comes to the governance reputation of a company. So a few things to discuss after you've done your research and you come across these various findings. You also have to interpret these findings. So one thing that's very important in measuring your research is the awareness threshold. So just because it's present in one source or another, it can't be measured the same as an item that's found throughout. So the volume of the findings, and not just that, also where are the findings found essentially? Is a company's reputation going to be as damaged by one article in a poorly written tabloid piece online, or by one comment on a Facebook post? It's not going to be as badly impacted as if it's written in one of the major newspapers or something to that effect. So an awareness threshold is something to really keep in mind. You also want to define when something is positive and when something is negative. It can't just be a feeling. There has to be metrics. So for instance, for a positive reputation, we would say, as just an example, it's obviously not extremely precise, but positive stories should make up more than 20% of the stories within a company, or sorry, within the online findings of a company. Negative stories should be less than 10% of the coverage, and the remainder should be neutral. So this is bottom line as a bare minimum for a company's reputation to be considered positive, as an example. And you also have to define, within the course of doing this, you also have to define exactly what is positive. And you have to have a standard definition across the board in order to be effective in your ESG evaluation, your ESG assessment. It's important to also note that reputation is vulnerable even if the media is focused on just a few topics, such as earnings and the personality of the CEO. While these may seem minor, like Benjamin Franklin said earlier, it takes years to build a good reputation and lots of effort to build a good reputation, but it could take one event to destroy it. So even if a company is doing great all along and has a positive reputation, all it takes is just a media intense focus on a couple bad incidents, and this can easily spiral out of control. So this is something that's very, very important to bear in mind. So before we get into case studies, I want to conclude the introduction with some statistics. So the Harvard Business Review did a study of 38 incidents of CEO misbehavior, and they found that the impact on reputation is not just significant, but it's long lasting, with hundreds of news stories being generated out of these 38 incidents as their sample set that they reviewed, and their references to them even 5 years later, meaning that a CEO could have done some action that's considered misbehavior, and 5 years later, the news is still talking about it. They also found that share prices on average declined by 3.1% over a 3-day trading period, even though sometimes the stock prices actually ended up reacting positively. On average, they declined by about 3.1%. And also, they noticed that 1/3 of companies faced additional fallout from the CEO's actions beyond the decline in the share prices. For instance, 1/3 of companies faced loss of a major client, or federal investigation, or shareholder action or lawsuits based on the CEO's actions. And I'm sure you guys have seen many examples of this, and we'll get into that later. But you can imagine that if CEO did some act of misbehavior, then later this leads to a demand for further investigations and greater attention to the company and to the CEO and other members of the board. And this oftentimes leads to increased findings, and then increased findings leads to lawsuits and so on and so forth. And of course, you can lose clients along the way. So this is just an overview of Harvard Business Review study. So I hope it was useful. So now with that in mind, I want to share with you some of the case studies from Sqope. So in the case of environment, there was a fund that was looking to invest into a mining company, and we at Sqope were asked to investigate whether it had a positive reputation, a positive ESG reputation. So the company was following the regulations where it was based, and in general, it was presenting itself as a green company. They shared online and on their website their various recycling policies and the fact that they use solar energy to power their offices. And in general, if you looked on their online reputation, if you looked at their websites and social media presence, it was presented as if this is a company that is taking steps to improve its environmental footprint, essentially. So the company also, beyond that, it issued various statements in support of environmental policies where they operated in. But after doing additional research, our Africa desk looked into local media coverage in the DRC, where the majority of the company's operations were conducted. And they found that the company was actually known locally for practices that resulted in heavy pollution, and it even had protests against the company in those areas. And the company was also known to be in violation of local environmental law, but it went unpunished due to corruption and lax enforcement in the DRC. So I want to make the distinction here. As someone who worked a long time in Africa and covered Africa for a big part of my professional career, a lot of times things that take place there they don't come to the attention of mainstream media, of Western media, even of local media in Africa. It takes a lot more of an event for it to actually reach it that far, even if the event itself was really impactful in the area where it took place. So it's not surprising that a company can appear to have a very positive reputation, but if you actually know how to research local sentiment and you spend the effort to find the local sentiment about the company, you'll see a completely different image. So we share this with the client, and after consultations with them and understanding how this could progress, how this reputation could rise itself to the surface. The fund actually chose not to invest in the company and protected itself from reputational damage. I want to present to you also a case study for the social reputational risk. So another fund reached out to Sqope prior to investing in a US-based company and asked us to evaluate the US company's reputation. So the company that we were looking into actually had a very low profile reputation in the public throughout most of its existence. But shortly before the client reached out to us, several employees from within that US-based company, they were commenting on social media. So it was just a matter of timing, but they started commenting about the workplace culture, including sexual harassment and various assaults that HR did not take seriously. So as a result of this, and considering the times and considering our observations of patterns pertaining to cases such as sexual harassment and poor workplace culture, we had an expectation this would actually expand, even though it was relatively minor at the time based on its traction and based on trends we observed. We expected this to actually lead to a lot greater negative exposure. So after we noticed this, there were several interviews conducted with former employees as a result of these comments, and that also led to additional online comments from former employees and current employees that revealed similar claims. And as a result of that, like I said, it expanded somewhat, and social media activists caught greater wind of it, and they honed in on the company, and then they started finding more and more information. So beyond these initial claims, they started looking for statements which they found from the executives that dismissed allegations during Me Too, and other executives were critical of Black Lives Matter protests, and other statements were found as well. But essentially, this created a perception of the company as one that has a very low very high social reputational risk, and not in line with the public's demand from a company today. So thankfully, because of this research, our client was actually shielded from this exposure early on and avoided reputational damage as well as some financial loss, because the US-based company they were looking into investing actually ended up losing clientele as a result of these developments. So lastly, I want to present a case study on governance reputational risk. And in this case, a major US family office actually asked Sqope to assess the ESG reputation of a Mauritius fund that was investing in East Africa. So when we first reviewed the fund, it appeared to have well-established ESG policies across the board, and everything seemed fine, and actually looked like a well-to-do and positive fund. But with some additional research and deeper dive, it was uncovered that one of the fund managers was previously convicted as part of a broader corruption scandal. And after that, we did further investigations using that as a lead, and found other associations of the fund manager who we determined was at risk of conducting such practices again in the future, because we saw a particular pattern and we thought that it was of high enough risk that's something we needed to alert the family office on. And as a result of this, the family office actually chose not to invest in the fund based on the findings that we presented them. So with that in mind, with the clear understanding of ESG, of reputational risk, and of course ESG reputational risk, I want to talk a bit about our solution and what Sqope offers to address this. So it should be clear now that when it comes to doing business in an ethical way and in a way that protects yourselves and protects your investments, financial professionals need to go the step further and investigate a company's ESG reputation. So our products are designed to do just that, and we see Sqope's ESG reputational assessment as a crucial step in assessing the risks associated with a potential investment or a fund. So in order to do this, we have designed two unique due diligence reports that focus exclusively on an entity's ESG reputation. So we have one report for fund managers to allow them to assess the reputation of a target company, its shareholders and managers. And we have one for investors such as family offices, ultra high net worth individuals, institutional investors, and others, which allows them to assess the reputation of a fund and its managers. And to the right, you see just a very small infographic, one of the few infographics in our report that kind of summarizes in a neat way a company's ESG risk. It takes the various elements of ESG and breaks them down per category, per environmental, social, and governance, and gives them each a ranking. And of course, our reports, I'm happy to share with you, go a lot deeper than this, but it's a nice presentation and to show a general summary, a general overview of a company's ESG reputational risk. So thank you very much for joining. It was my pleasure to speak with you. It was my pleasure to share with you our view on ESG reputational risk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out via esg@iqeq.com. And I'd like to thank you again, and thank you, Alex, and we'll be in touch. Have a great one, everyone.